how is it then that, for example, the soldiers at the war were able to just stop drugs that are so notoriously super addictive? How is it that people I used with in school or uni just stopped when that season of their life was over and I didn't? How come some people can use things in moderation and I can't? Now, we know from science and from the drastic increase of addiction in our society that addiction is not a disease you're born with. That is a 100-year-old theory, and True Freedom takes you through an actual model and process of learning the truth and debunking the deception. However, there's nothing new under the sun. There's lots and lots of books out there, especially now, that are highlighting this and that are showing, and some of them go more into the science, some of them go more into the psychology, some of them, there's a couple that go into the theology. Why is it then that some can just stop? And why is it then that some can use in moderation? It's because of the difference between addiction being invasive and pervasive. So the word invasive is when something foreign enters as an invasion into something else, and it's there, it's in that something else. Pervasion is when something consumes the something else. It fills it. It becomes part of it. So the difference here, the answer to these questions, is the difference between invasive addiction and pervasive addiction. So this vase is you. And the water within that vase is you. It's your life. This is you as an individual, as a person. Okay? Then, this is addiction. It's life, it's substance, it's activity, but it's tainted, it's poisoned, it's corrupted. Now, for a lot of people, and I would say maybe most people when they first start using something addictive, that's how it begins. It's invasive. This thing has entered you and your life. But there are all these parts of you and your life that remain the same. Now, even for such people who, say, for example, use in moderation, or for people who use just for a season, and they'll say, oh, you know, that was my uni days, or whatever, this around is kind of unaffected, but it's still affected, because every time something shakes that, they lose parts of themselves. They lose parts of their lives. And it might just be, I'm not functioning on 100% clarity because that one glass of red wine 5 nights a week is lowering my deep sleep, and then I'm not washing the toxins out of my brain properly, and now I'm so used to it I don't even notice, but I don't function the way I used to. I don't think as clearly, and I maybe blame it on age, or I blame it on, but actually I'm losing something. Or it might be that night when that person just socially did something, and then the next day they wake up and find out they did something awful when they were under the influence, or they're blacked out and they're terrified of what they might have done. So even people for whom it stays nicely in this little invasive bubble, that it's still costing something of life the whole time that it's there. This is when, though, a soldier in a war can then leave the war and lose the addiction. This is when a uni student can party every weekend, barely get through their exams. They have lost things, and they've made mistakes, and they did things that are going to haunt them forever. But now uni days are over, not addicted anymore. This is the person who can just, smoke a bit of weed every now and then, but it's not taking their job or their family or their dignity away. This is the person who can have a bit of sugar and ultra-processed food, but it's not making them ill. It's not making them ashamed of who they are. This is the person who can have the odd drink. These are the people who, if they wanted and recognised it for what it is, it could also just go away. However, most of them will just stay like this forever. because it's not doing any severe damage and harm, but it is taking something. But it only takes for something in our circumstances, something in our being to shift, to change, to upend this picture, for the ball to crack. And then the addiction is pervasive. The corruption, the poison, the brokenness, the dysfunction, that no longer is an invasion in a separate part of you. It's now a pervasion through your whole life and being. That is when a person, you can't just take that out. Can I take the dye out of that water now? Can I remove the dye from this vase? I can't take the dye out. So that's now pervasive, and this is now an addict who can't just stop. An addict who can't just have one glass, who can't just smoke one spliff, who can't just eat a bit of cake without it becoming 12 cakes, without it becoming every day smoking a spliff just to feel like you can walk out the door, without it becoming drinking spirits constantly. Does that make sense? Because you can't now remove it. Addiction is a short-circuiting of the reward centre in the brain. The reward centre is designed by God to release this feel-good chemical called dopamine. And how it works, and I've explained this a little bit before, but how it works and how it's designed to work is that your brain releases a little bit of it as a reward for the thing that you did, right? But then your brain clocks that that thing felt good and was good for you, that it made you feel better, that it gave you something, and it then releases more of that dopamine in anticipation of you doing that thing later. And as I said to you last time, dopamine is an anticipatory activating chemical. So dopamine and serotonin, most of you will have heard of serotonin. They're both feel-good chemicals, but serotonin is a relaxant feel-good chemical. It doesn't initiate the next neuron, it calms, right? So serotonin is a precursor to melatonin for sleep. It's a soothing, positive chemical, happy chemical, whereas dopamine is an activating happy chemical. It activates the next neuron. It leads to something. It charges a person. So God designed our brains to release dopamine to activate us and motivate us to do the effort, to do the work that it takes to get the thing that is good for us. So in order to eat, the brain releases dopamine when, back in the day, the brain would release dopamine when a person saw a deer that they could perhaps manage to shoot, or bow and arrow back in that day. When the brain saw the harvest coming up, the crops coming up that needed harvesting. As time went on, it became maybe arriving to the supermarket. And now you can even just hit a button. And this is one of the reasons why food, although it's not food addiction, we'll come to that, is so addictive, is because we've removed the effort. So the brain is designed to release dopamine to motivate us. So whether it's food, water, sex, or anything that's good for us, making money, or it would have been trading crops or whatever, the brain is designed by God to give us a feel-good motivation to get the feel-good result. That is awesome of our God. And that is in the part of the brain that he created to do the background. So we've got three parts. One of them does the super background stuff, as in pumping blood around your veins, putting oxygen in and out of your lungs, regulating your temperature. So that's one part, does the super basic stuff. Then the other part, where things like the reward center and the amygdala are that we talk about, that part is fueling our actions and our activities in the background. Then the other part is the part that communes with God, the part that thinks logically, thinks rationally, that can analyze, that prays, and all of these things, right? So God has made, and do you know what I love about this? It so mirrors the nature of God that I see all through the Bible of interdependent diversity. Like, whether it's the fivefold gifts, whether it's male and female, whether it's the Trinity of God himself, God is a God of interdependent diversity. He makes different parts need each other. And he's even done it down to the very brain. So these 3 parts, he could have just made all the brain all 3, but he didn't. He could have just made all the 5-fold gifts all the same, but he didn't, right? He's made things different so that they need each other. And he's even done that with our very brains. So in this, what we'll call the subconscious part, which includes both the first 2, but in this subconscious part, God has given us fuel for the engine of surviving. He's given us dopamine to motivate and excite us to do the work and the effort required to get the thing that keeps us alive. You know, they've done loads of experiments on rats, even just about dopamine. But one of them, they took away the dopamine in a rat's brain. I don't know how they did it, but they did it. I'm not a lab scientist. But they took the dopamine out of the rats' brains, and the rats starved to death because they didn't have the motivation to eat. They couldn't be bothered to eat. When one of the scientists literally put food to their mouth, they could just about chew and swallow. But they wouldn't even go just across the cage to get food and water. The dopamine was what would have motivated them to do it. Another experiment that they did with rats was where they put a button that when they pressed that button, they were zapped with dopamine, right? Again, I don't know how I'm going to look that up sometime, how they did it, because wow. But when the rats pressed that button, they were zapped with dopamine. And basically it got to the place where the rats were just pressing that button so much, and the food was next to the button. And at first they would press the button and they'd eat some food. Then they'd press the button more, eat food less. And in not much time at all, they were just pressing the button frantically until they just dropped dead. So dopamine is a gift from God to give us the motivation and the energy and the impetus to put the effort in towards something that keeps us alive, something good for us, right? Yeah. What addiction does is it removes the effort. So it's where you get a dopamine hit without any effort, without the dopamine actually fulfilling its purpose. Because then you release dopamine in anticipation of that thing to get you to do the effort, but there is no effort. So it becomes like a short-circuited wiring that misfires because it's not working properly. That's what happens to dopamine release in our brain. It becomes malfunctioned, it becomes short-circuited, and it stops working properly. Now, food is such a good example of this, because this is why ultra-processed food, even down to the very internal bodily activity, ultra-processed food is so addictive. And guys, food isn't addictive, right? I'm sure we've all heard people talk about things like cheese and cream as things that they have to be careful with and take in moderation because they're luxurious and you want more. But no one's ever been addicted to cheese or cream. The reason why ultra-processed food is so addictive is because it even takes away the effort and work of the body. Because ultra-processed food has basically been pre-chewed, right? In essence, it's already been broken down and then put back together. So the moment it hits your stomach acid, your body has no work to do. It just falls apart. And so that dopamine is even more corrupted than with external effort that's taken away. Even the internal effort is taken away. So it really short circuits and corrupts that dopamine release and the way that God designed that to work. So both are addiction. The food dye is exactly the same in both cases. Addiction and how it works on the brain, that is what it is, regardless of whether it's an invasion in the ball or whether it's pervasion in your whole being. It's still addiction. But one is less controlling, does less obvious harm, and can just be stopped. Some people's addictions stay in the ball. Invasive but not pervasive. And it is still an addiction. So like someone might say, oh, I'm just a social smoker. But I put my house on it, they coughed their guts up the first time they took a drag, as their body rejected the poison. Someone might say like, oh, I just drink in moderation, but I know for a fact their body reacted the first time they took it like your body reacts to a poison, which is like blurriness, vomiting, diarrhea, dizziness, if they drank enough. And also the biggest sign, any mammal approaching a poison hates the taste. No one likes the first taste. But then, as we'll come to later, we build tolerance. But whether that addiction is, addiction can stay in that ball. It can stay invasive, or it can be pervasive. Now, one of the ways that it's invasive is when there's a lot of other healthy activity in that person's life. So if that person is getting a lot of dopamine from good things, and if that person's also getting other good things like serotonin and oxytocin, and they're getting other good stuff because, say, that person has grown up in a really healthy environment, a healthy upbringing, they've got love around them, they've got discipline, they've got self-discipline, they've got self-credibility, they've got fulfillment, they've got things they are working at and towards. They've got effort and achievement in their life. That person has so much healthy water that it can keep the addiction water invasive, not pervasive. Yeah? Now, some of us found that the ball broke incredibly quickly because the water was already discoloured by other things in our lives. The dopamine reward centre was already damaged in some way. There already wasn't a healthy dopamine release going on in that brain, and other activity, because they all interact with each other. All these different parts of the brain, it's all interactive. So when a person grows up in an environment where that water's not very healthy to start with, then that ball is going to break really easily, because it's like in like, and your brain doesn't know the difference, so one just becomes the other. Yeah? Now the thing is, for other people, and this happened a lot through lockdown, I got quite a lot of messages from people saying, Bex, I'm not an addict, but. Because before lockdown, they would just have a glass of wine with their dinner, or they would just smoke a spliff on the odd weekend, right? Or they would just gamble as a game, and it was just a game on their phone. But then when lockdown came, and the commute was taken away, and the having to be places at certain times was taken away, and all the activity with people in their life was taken away, suddenly that water around the ball became less healthy, became less reliable, became less different to what was in the ball, and the ball started to crack and it started to seep. And then they were messaging me, some people who I barely even know, like on Facebook and stuff, messaging me saying, I'm not an addict, but, you know, it started with this. And I thought, well, I could just do that then. Well, I haven't got work tomorrow now. And, well, it's only Zoom. And before they knew it, and this is the thing, it's like one of the things Annie Grace talks about in her book, This Naked Mind, which 100% you all should read. It's so fantastic. It's such a brilliant book. And she talks about a friend of hers who just has a couple of beers at the weekend or something. And I think she even says that he's a Christian. And she says he looks forward to those 2 beers, but he thinks he's completely safe because that's all he's having. And she talks about how, she doesn't say this, I'm saying it, but that's an invasive thing. But she talks about how he's walking a tightrope because that looking forward to is the malfunctioning of the dopamine. And once something in his life, when that spouse passes away and work makes you redundant, your house gets repossessed, and you can't hear God all of a sudden, that's when it's Russian roulette. So a person can keep that ball, the addiction in that invasive ball their whole lives, but any moment, for any reason, in this unpredictable thing we call life, something can crack or break that ball. Another reason why something can stay as a ball is when the brain is able to recognize that there's something very, very different about the context that is happening in to the rest of your life. So, for example, the best example is the soldiers. War was so different to pre-war and post-war that a lot of the time, as soon as the soldiers got home, unless they went back to dysfunction and pain and that water that wasn't very healthy to start with, they've done all sorts of studies on this, but the ones who went back to a loving home with a life pursuit still waiting for them to fulfill and things like that, as soon as they got back, they stopped, because the brain recognised that use as something very different to the rest of their lives. It recognised the context of that addiction as different, as separate, a compartment of them. Whereas, when that addiction goes into what we see and what our brain recognises as normal life, it's pervasive. So our systems would say that a lot of people use in moderation and that other people misuse and it's taken over their lives, and that those people are addicts. Now, it's now so clearly evident by science, and most of us in the church have always known, because of certain scriptures, that it doesn't make sense that some people are just born addicts and they're going to stay addicts for the rest of their life. Hi, I'm Bob and I'm an addict. Like, Christians have always been a bit, what happened to new creation? What happened to transforming? Like, what happened to the old has gone, the new has come? But now science is showing us that people aren't born addicts and then they're an addict for the rest of their life, like they're born with some defective disease that others don't have. Instead, addiction is a manipulation and short-circuiting of the reward centre in the brain, and all of us have that same brain designed that same way, and so all of us can become addicted. But there are all these other factors that determine whether that stays invasive or becomes pervasive.